Today I'm going to talk about our research program looking at the pitfalls of talent identification and development. And in the program, it says that I'm going to provide some recommendations for coaches. And I think I'll give you the punchline of the talk right at the start, which is we have very few evidence-based recommendations that we can give to coaches because the thinking and the evidence that we have in this area is so limited, which on the one hand is, you could see that as a negative. We like to frame that as a more positive thing. There's lots of opportunity here for development. There's lots of opportunity here for creativity from coaches. If we go to the sports coach handbook that was talked about in the first session, if you look at those model coaches that are used in the chapters there, they're not thinking someone else has the answer. They're using their own creativity to solve problems. And I think we need that same sort of initiative to solve the problems that we have with talent identification and development. And so what I'd like to do today is just talk a little bit about what we know about some of the issues in this area, how they relate to coaching, particularly coaching kids, and then how we might move forward. Okay. So regardless of how we personally think about the concept of talent, and this is a really debatable issue, it can be quite heated debates among coaching groups at different times. The notion of talent is fundamental to how we think about sport and athlete development. It's the reasons why we see the strong growth in academy type systems in professional sports, why we have traveling and representative teams in youth sports. They're all based on this idea that there's something important that we need to be developing during the youth period of engagement, whether you call that talent or skill or whatever. We've got an entire sport program that's designed with this concept kind of as the central assumption of the entire program. In our recent research, we started to look at the amount of evidence that we have for this concept. As you can see here, there's a massive increase in the interest in talent. This is studies that have explored any angle or element of talent over the last 30 years. As you can see, the inflection of that line suggests there's a lot of growth that's happening here. What I want to point out, though, is where that line starts to inflect. That's at 2000. Okay, so that's 20 years of research, of hard research interest in this area, which means that we have very limited research on this topic, because 20 years in terms of science is not a long time for ideas to be pushed and prodded and replicated and challenged and debated. 20 years is not a lot of time. And so right from the onset, we're quite comfortable with the conclusion that we don't have evidence-based solutions for many of the problems that coaches are facing in their day-to-day coaching practice. Why is this important? Well, Kev and Barnaby did a great job of outlining what the traditional or typical talent ID system looks like. Here's a different way of framing that. The number of steps in your sport will be somewhat context specific, but in general, we choose people that are at the far right-hand side of a normal distribution, and we choose them to move on in our system. Kev presented that as a pyramid. We've done some work more recently to suggest that if it is a pyramid, it's a really, really lopsided one. And so here's an example to support that conclusion. So these are some data from basketball in the United States, which of all the sports we've looked at, their numbers are what we'd say the most dramatic. So in any one year, there's around 3.6 million male youth playing basketball. And if we want to understand the development of these youth to the NBA level, to get to the NBA, you almost always have to go to a high school or secondary school with the basketball program. In that selection step, we're now dealing with just 15% of that original population. Somewhere around 500,000 kids will play at the high school level on a basketball team. from that, the next step, you almost always have to go to a Division I basketball program in the US. Now we're down to 0.5% of that original population. From there, the NBA has a 2-round draft. Now we're dealing with 0.002% of that original population. Of those that go to the NBA, we're talking about 0.001% of the original population. So we spend a lot of time focusing on the elite athlete side of this trajectory, but the real cost to the system is occurring early on. It's those selection steps for who gets to play on a high school team or who gets to go to a Division I college program. The odds of a person who's playing at the youth level making it to the NBA is 1 in 70,000. That's okay. Those numbers aren't necessarily threatening if we're comfortable saying that we know that one person in the 70,000, we're making those selections accurately. More recently, the work that we've been doing suggests that we're actually not as good at identifying talent as we think we are. And so this work really challenges this idea that we're good at identifying that 1 in 70,000. We're good at identifying that diamond in the rough or that needle in the haystack. Why are our predictions about talent so poor? Well, first off, the scientific community has a role to play here, and we've been negligent in designing good models or good theory for understanding talent. And if you look at that research base over the last 30 years, most of it has focused on talent as a physical outcome, anthropometrics, physiological, physical. These things are easy to measure. It's no surprise that we see more research in this area. But coaches and people that work in talent know that talent isn't just physical, it's mental. It's the psychological elements, it's perception, it's cognition. Not only is it those things independently, but it's all of those things combined in order to be able to demonstrate exceptional performance. And so we need to do a better job of capturing the elegance and the complexity of what talent actually is. We also have a problem of the prediction of talent takes place over a really extensive, what we call forecast horizon. We make decisions about who's the best, who's got the most potential at the youth level, and those decisions have long-term implications. But the things that we use to make those decisions at the youth level, in the picture here on the left, we see the size. Oftentimes at the youth level, we focus on physical elements, size, power, strength. Well, those things aren't the same things that predict success at the adult level. That doesn't mean they're not important. It just means that eventually in athlete development, we get to a point where everybody's fast, everybody's strong. And so what's the thing that actually predicts whether that person is going to be successful or not? So we need to understand that complexity over that forecast horizon in order to make good decisions later on. Or an alternative approach would be to not make that decision early on and to keep everyone involved for longer because we don't have evidence to not do that. A third factor is a lack of knowledge. So most of the research in this area has been done with what we call a cross-sectional approach. They'll take snapshots of athletes in time. So here on this graph, you can see, well, we want to know what peak performance in an Olympic champion looks like. And then we'll use that information to try to retrospectively predict what type of performance would be necessary as a youth level. And so we might look at elite 9-year-olds or 11-year-olds or 13-year-olds, and we would plot their points on this kind of a graph. The problem with that is, and I feel like I'm speaking or preaching to the choir here, most coaches know that athlete development doesn't look like that. The person who's at the highest level isn't necessarily always the best person in that population. We don't know if athlete development looks like this trajectory where the person is always at the top of performers, or whether it looks more like this, where it's a progression of constant improvement over time relative to their peers, or whether it's like this, just some kind of convoluted and complex mess that's really, really difficult to use to predict somebody's future. We need to understand what that profile looks like, not just of the elite athlete who eventually becomes a champion, but of all the other people in that system who did not, because we need to understand the noise in the system in order to develop good models to support coaches, and so that they can understand the implications of what they do. And the last factor that I want to talk about today is our biases in the system. So administrative and policy biases that drive things like relative age effects, where the relatively oldest children are more likely to be successful, or socioeconomic status effects, where richer kids get more opportunities than kids that are from lower SES backgrounds. But also the things that we're most excited about are biases that coaches and athletes have about the way that they think about talent that affect their long-term prognosis for success. And here on you can't see this, but if anybody's interested, I'm happy to send this graphic. This is called the Cognitive Bias Codex. It's a couple psychologists created this diagram to show just how many different biases in the way that our brain processes information have been identified in research studies. And we're up to about 200 different biases. And one of the areas that our brain especially struggles with information processing is when we process risk. And for coaches, talent identification and athlete selection is at its heart a risk exercise. What's the risk of deselecting this athlete versus selecting this other athlete? Those are risk scenarios. And we know that our brain has a difficult time with those types of information processing tasks. And so we're trying to understand the biases that coaches might have here that affect the way they think about their athletes. So it's not all doom and gloom. There are things that we can do to improve our situation. The first, I think, for researchers is we need to be more combative and adversarial. Models are only as valuable as the evidence that supports them. We need to do a better job of pushing models around and challenging assumptions that those models make, because stretching those models in different ways helps to show where the gaps are and the limitations are. And that's important. That's how science is supposed to work. We can't all just agree and smile and be happy with our models. We need to push them, and we need people who will push models around. For practitioners, we need to understand the implications of selection and deselection. So, for example, we like to look at talent identification as if it's a binary. Does this person have it? Yes or no? But we need to understand that there's a lot of people in the middle that are maybes. And we have a talent system that really focuses on the yes in that equation. The yes people are not at risk of leaving your program. Because of what we know about competence motivation and achievement motivation, somebody who's getting those needs met, they're not at risk. They're going to stay. But we need to spend more time focusing on the maybes, because we should be spending more time focusing on things that we could get wrong instead of worrying about the things that we need to get right. And if we do that, we would think about our athletes in a different way. The other assumption is that we know exactly what is required to make an elite athlete or a successful champion, and we don't. We know how to mess up athlete development. We know how to get people to withdraw or to get less enjoyment. Maybe we should focus on those things more than we have been. The last thing I would say to coaches is to be comfortable plotting your own path. Become your own scientist. Create your own way of measuring the progression and the success of your athletes, because the problem with the limited research from the sports science community is we don't have that answer for you. We can't say with your under 9s or with your under 11s, this is what their development needs to look like, because we don't have that evidence. Hopefully one day we will, But at the moment, we need your assistance with this. We need questions from the coaching community that reflect your experience. I had an athlete that looked like this. Does this make sense with your current science? And to have that dialogue, that back and forth communication between what the scientists are doing and what the coaches are doing and what the coaches need, I think is a really important step forward in the way that we're going to explore these issues. So hopefully you can tell that I'm really interested in this area. And if you have any questions, hopefully there's some in the chat box, but if not, feel free to get in touch with me. There's my email address. I'm on a couple of social media platforms as well, where we have these kinds of discussions all the time. And again, I'll just say thanks to the iCoachKids for this opportunity. This has been really fun.